Hi, everybody. Welcome to Garden Party. We're the virtual series from the Southern California News Group to give you tips, tricks, and insights into getting the most joy and productivity out of your gardening experience. And also to find a community of like-minded green thumbs, or in my case, wannabe green thumbs. Hi, I'm Sam Dunn. I'm the Special Projects Editor at SCNG. I want to say thank you to our Reader Reward subscribers and to all of you who've made our ongoing virtual program so popular. By the way, if you're a Reader Reward subscriber attending today, you're automatically entered to win a $100 gift card to Home Depot. Hello, someone's talking. Anyway, I just need to tell you a few things before we get started. All attendees are muted to allow for the free flow of conversation. But if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature on the toolbar on your screen. And certainly if you want to add comments, use the chat feature found there as well. We're going to be monitoring questions and comments and respond as much as possible. This session will be videotaped and a link will be sent to you so you can share or revisit some of your favorite moments. It's also posted at scng.com/virtual events, where you can find all of our past virtual shows as well as see what's coming up. And now I'm going to turn this baby over to our host, Vanessa Franco. She's the SCNG Digital Director of Entertainment. So Vanessa, take it away.
Hi, I'm Vanessa. I'm one of the editors here. I am also trying to grow tomatoes, probably like many of you who are tuning in today. Today, we are joined by Laura Simpson. She is our Master Gardener columnist. You have probably recognized her if you get the paper because she has answered your questions on everything from what to do if you find a dead squirrel in your groundwater that goes to feeding your plants to how to help your sad avocado trees. And a number of people have sad avocado trees. I feel bad for them. Also joining us today is Alex Groves. Alex is our casinos reporter by day, but he's also a big-time garden geek. If you get our Garden Party newsletter, Alex is the one telling you all about tomatoes. So again, we are going to answer your questions today. We put your questions in the question box. We have some great ones already. We're going to set it up with a little bit of info and also talk a little bit about why we're focusing on just tomatoes. Like if you joined us last week, it was all about, or not last week, last month, was all about houseplants. So tomatoes are the most popular plant that people grow. And every year, and Laura can attest to this, people ask us about tomatoes all the time. And like they want to know about blossom end rot. They want to know about all these things. Plus, like, let's be honest, having a tomato grown in your backyard, or in my case, on my patio, tastes so much better than the ones I find at the grocery store. So with that, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you need to know if you're going to start growing tomatoes. Alex, can you take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. Like Vanessa mentioned, I'm the casinos reporter for Southern California News Group, and I'm also a big-time gardener. And if you've received the Garden Party email, the Garden Party emails, I'm the person that's been sending those out. And so let's talk a little bit about tomatoes and kind of some of the basic things that you need to know when you're caring for them. I think we have some slides, right, Julie? There we go. Awesome. Alrighty, so for starters, I think one of the most important things to know is that there are a variety of different tomatoes, right? So the kinds of tomatoes that you grow determine also, where you're going to put them and how much space you're going to need and what you need to know throughout the season. So there are three main types of tomatoes. The first one is indeterminate tomatoes, and those are the most common kind of tomatoes that you'll generally find. They're things like your beefsteak tomatoes, your Cherokee purples, your medium-sized tomatoes, early varieties, things like Early Girl and Better Boy and cherry tomatoes. A lot of those things that you commonly find at nurseries are indeterminate tomatoes. And what that means is that they will grow throughout the season, assuming that the weather stays right. So they'll continue putting out new shoots and leaves, and they'll continue making fruit if temperature conditions are optimal. So that's the first and most common kind of tomato that you'll find. Another kind of tomato that's pretty common is determinate tomatoes. And determinate tomatoes are tomatoes that essentially have a set output and set size limit, right? So basically, when you plant a determinate tomato, they will reach a certain size and stop, and all their fruit will come ripe within the same amount of time. Those are a little bit less common, but you'll also find them at nurseries and garden sales and things of that nature. And then the third category is dwarf tomatoes, and these are becoming increasingly popular. I recently interviewed Craig LaHoulier, who is one of 2 people who is involved with the Dwarf Tomato Project. One of the 2 founders of the project, and basically what they've been doing is breeding these dwarf varieties. They're taking traditional longstanding dwarf tomatoes and breeding them with heirlooms to create a greater assortment of dwarves. And basically what dwarves are is they kind of combine the best of both worlds from the indeterminate and determinate categories. They're their own thing, but basically they will stay small. And they're compact genetically. They'll stay a certain size throughout the season, and or they'll grow, but they'll grow more slowly than an indeterminate would, right? So they'll only get to maybe 2 or 3 feet for versus an indeterminate, which will grow to 4, 5, 6 feet, and they'll stay small, but they'll still make full-size tomatoes. You can get fruit that's up to 60 ounces from a dwarf tomato. So those are kind of like the different varieties that you'll see. And indeterminates are really easy to find at nurseries. Determinates and dwarfs are a little bit harder. But you can find dwarf seeds at lots of seed places, seed websites. And so real quick, I want to show you kind of, as an example, so you see kind of the difference between an indeterminate tomato and a dwarf tomato, just so you can see the difference in size. So these were planted at the same time. This is a Thai pink egg. It's one of the ones that I commonly plant every year. It's a little bit curvier, leggier than I want it to be, but it'll be okay once I plant it in my parents' backyard. And this is a dwarf. This is called a Perth Pride tomato. It's one of the ones that was bred for the Dwarf Tomato Project. And as you can see, these were planted around the same time, and the indeterminate tomato is twice the size of the dwarf tomato. So these will both make fruits throughout the season, but this one will grow much faster and at a bigger rate and will be much larger by the end of the season. This will be 3 or 4 feet tall at the tallest it's going to be. So that kind of gives you a sense of the differences in terms of different tomato varieties. And then if we want to hop over to the slide, I can talk a little bit more about some of the other stuff here. All right, cool. So that is the different kinds of tomatoes. There are a few things that are really important that you should consider having when you're starting this process. First of all, gloves. You're going to want those. You don't want, thorns and needles in your hands and stuff like from weeds and stuff. It's important to have gloves to keep your hands protected. A garden spade or shovel. That's important. Obviously, you're going to want to be able to dig space in the ground for your tomato. There are a couple different ways that you can plant tomatoes. So obviously I mentioned indeterminates. Those are better if you plant them in the ground or in a planter box. You can plant indeterminates in a pot, but it's generally a little bit easier to grow them in ground or in a planter box. It's a little harder to care for them if they are in a pot. Pots are generally more optimal for determinates and dwarf tomatoes since they stay small. But yeah, so you're going to want potting soil, certainly, if you're going to put them in a pot. And you're going to want a watering can. So there are a few different ways that you can water your tomatoes. I generally like a watering can because it makes it easier to water them from the bottom. So that's an important thing, right? You don't want to water your tomatoes from the top. You want to keep them kind of watered from the bottom, because if you do overhead watering, that makes them more susceptible to certain kinds of diseases and fungal pathogens. So I find that a watering can is just pretty easy to pick the watering can up and water around the base of the plant. Fertilizer, you're going to want to fertilize consistently throughout the season, both at the time that you plant the tomato and throughout the season. Shade cloth. This is going to be an important thing later in the season as it gets hotter. Obviously tomatoes like sunny weather. They prefer 6 to 8 hours, but as it gets to be really hot, really warm outside, you're going to want to keep them protected, right? And that also mitigates some of the problems that you can see in terms of, sun scald on the fruit, or even, it can help to keep tomatoes producing if they're a degree or two cooler. Pest control, as you get pests later in the season, that's something that you want to you're going to want to have on hand. You know, you're going to want to have certain things like BT or things to control the insects. And tomato cages and trellises, that's something that you're going to want earlier in the process. It's important to have some way to keep your tomatoes supported. So there are a variety of ways you can do that. Some people like cages. They're those kind of cone-shaped things that you see at nurseries. They'll have 3 prongs at the end, and the round end of the cone will go on the top of the tomato. There are also various trellising systems and stakes, but really the most important thing is as your tomato is growing, no matter what kind of tomato you're going to have, you want to make sure that it's supported and kept in good shape. So those are all some important things to keep in mind. And then as we get later into the season, there are some other things that you're going to want to keep in mind. If we can switch over to the next slide here. All right. Okay, so we talked a little bit about pots, right? So as I previously mentioned, you really want to have determinants and dwarfs in your pots. Those are going to be easier to grow in pots than indeterminates. Again, you can grow an indeterminate in a pot. It's just going to be a little bit more challenging just because they can get so tall and they can spread out so much. So keep that in mind. If you're going to, if you have like an apartment or you have a patio and you have limited space, you're going to want to keep your tomatoes in. You're going to want to maybe consider getting determinants or dwarves and putting them in pots. The pot should be fairly large. You can't get those like, 8-inch at the top terracotta pots that you see at Home Depot. You need to have a pot that's at least 15 inches across and 15 inches deep. If you can find a bigger pot than that, a 20-inch wide or 20-inch pot, that's going to be even better. And then, like I mentioned before, you're going to want to keep them in a place where they get lots of sunlight. So the optimal amount of sunlight is going to be 6 to 8 hours for a tomato plant. And then let's head over to the next slide here.
And Laura, looks like Laura's still connecting with the audio, but one of the big things is that when you are picking out that plant, or I'm sorry, not the plant, you want that pot to have drainage holes. Because that's a big, big problem if you don't have, because then you're just drowning your tomato plants and they don't like that. Don't ask me how I know.
Yeah, they don't like it at all. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Can't see you, but I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm having technical difficulties with my laptop. I think my dog like plopped himself down on the cable or something. Yeah, you'd be amazed at how many pots don't have drain holes. So always make sure you have some sort of drainage in your pot. Because if the roots get waterlogged and they start to rot, most of the time you can't recover from that. The plant's going to die. And if you find that did happen and the plant's starting to wilt, sometimes you can take a cutting and start it from that and recover your plant that way. But otherwise, make sure you don't have drainage problems. That's the main thing.
Yeah, that's definitely really important. Is you need to have well draining soil, and obviously if your pot doesn't have that at the bottom, then that's going to make it hard for you to be able to have that well draining soil. So that's an important thing. And then there are other things that you need to think about before planting. You're going to want to make sure, especially if you're planting in a pot or really anywhere, if you're planting in the pot or in a garden, the soil needs to be rich. It needs to be properly amended with good stuff that you can grow the tomato. So you're going to want to add a compost to either to your potting soil, or you can add that into your garden and kind of till it in. But you're going to want to have rich organic materials because that's going to help the tomato to grow even better. So as you go to your local box store, places like Home Depot and Lowe's, you'll find composts. There are some that have a wide variety of ingredients. The more ingredients, the better. There are also ones that use a lot of organic material. You can find composts that use steer or chicken manure. Those are also good options. And there are also, and this is something that I learned from Vanessa, there are soils that come pre-mixed with the compost in them already. So that's one that she picked up, right, is one that had lots of organic material in it and lots of compost already. So that's a good option too if it's already pre-mixed. And then another thing is when you're planting your tomatoes, you're going to want to make sure that you're planting them deep, whether you're planting them in the garden or planting them in a pot. You'll want to bury 2/3 of the stem in dirt. So when you go to the nursery and you look at the stem, you'll see that the tomato plant has all these like fine little hairs along the stem. Those have the capability to become roots, right? So however deep you bury that stem in the ground is where its root system is going to begin. So obviously, the deeper you bury it, the more roots it's going to have, the more support it's going to have. So that's really important. Make sure that you're burying it deep, at least 2/3 of the stem in dirt. And then obviously you probably will have some branches that are on those lower levels of the stem where you plan to plant it. You're going to want to cut those before you plant it in the ground. And then fertilizer, we talked a little bit about fertilizer earlier. You're going to want to consistently fertilize throughout the season. Make sure that you're following the directions because every fertilizer is different. Some may require you to, fertilize every 2 weeks. Some may say every 7 to 10 days. It kind of tends to vary depending on what their ingredients are and the concentration of those ingredients. So make sure that you're paying attention to that so you don't burn out your plants.
Yep, Alex, that was one of the questions from one of our readers. I think it was Greg. Greg had that question about like fertilizing per direction. So you're talking about the directions on the actual box, right? Like
correct. Yeah. Yeah.
So I got the Miracle Grow ones, and I did not follow the directions at first, which was pretty dumb, even though you told me to follow the directions. So don't be like me and actually read the directions and make sure you are putting the right amount of fertilizer in the right amount of water. I put too much fertilizer in too little water, but so far the plants aren't dead. So, hey, I got that going for me.
Awesome. Good that your plants aren't dead. So obviously, if you follow the directions on the package, that's going to help. All fertilizers, no matter what fertilizer you buy from the store, will have directions on, what quantity you're supposed to mix into the water. If it's like a granular mix that you mix in with water or what have you, it'll have directions on what quantity and how often to put that on your plant. So yeah, just follow the directions. Another thing is to look at the concentration of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are kind of the 3 main ingredients that you'll find in fertilizers, and those are really important components. And so as you begin the season, you can start with a really well-balanced fertilizer. This is something that I learned from one of our experts that we interviewed. You can start with something like a Miracle Grow that has equal quantities of nitrogen and phosphorus, and that will help get your plant jump-started. It'll get you those, strong stems and big, green, beautiful leaves. As the season progresses, if you find that you're not getting the yield that you want in terms of tomatoes, you can start to off that fertilizer and maybe switch to a different variety. You can get a fertilizer that's maybe higher in phosphorus and lower in nitrogen. So nitrogen gives you those big green leaves, right? But it doesn't necessarily give you, a lot of blossoms and a lot of fruit. Phosphorus is the component that's going to give you those things. So if you find that you've got, big healthy green plants, but you want more fruit, you can switch to a blend of fertilizer that's higher in phosphorus and lower in nitrogen. And when you go to the store, when you go to Home Depot or you go to Lowe's or what have you, when you pick up one of these packages, you can look and it'll have generally those numbers either on the front of the package or the back of the package. And it'll say, it'll be a ratio. It'll be something like, 18 nitrogen, 18 phosphorus, 21 potassium, or something of that nature. And so it'll tell you. And so you can look and you can see which ones are higher in phosphorus and which ones are higher in nitrogen. So that's something to keep in mind too. And then let's switch over to the next slide here. And then once you plant your tomatoes, you're going to want to think about some things that you need for them at that stage. As we mentioned, having a support system for your tomatoes is going to be important. Any variety of tomato that you grow, but especially indeterminates, they need to have something that keep them supported as they continue to put out that new growth and more tomatoes. And so that could be things like tomato cages or trellises or stakes. You're going to want to make sure that you're watering correctly for your tomato plants. And so this is the hard part because there's no hard and set number for your tomato plants, right? It kind of depends on how mature your plants are and what time of the season it is and how hot it is outside. And you're going to have to adjust your watering in general to what your seasonal conditions are at that point. A good benchmark that a lot of experts recommend is between 1 and 2 inches of water, which is kind of really hard to quantify. How do you determine what 1 to 2 inches of water is? And really the answer to that is, about a half a gallon to 1.2 gallons per square foot. So in a square foot space, that would be about 1 to 2 inches is half a gallon to 1.2 gallons. That's not a hard and set number. Again, you may water less in the beginning of the season. You may water more later in the season. It may be more than 1.2 gallons that you put on your plants. And you may be watering every day versus in the beginning of the season, you might be watering once every 3 days. So that's one thing that you're going to have to work on is, experimenting with watering and making sure that the watering is correct for your plant as the season goes on. So let's switch to the next slide here. So another thing that's going to be really important is just constantly checking your garden, right? So that's going to be really important. Go out in the mornings, go out in the evenings, look at how your plants look. Your plants will tell you if they're not doing well. There will be signs and symptoms that you can see to determine what the right thing is for your plants, right? So you may see that your plant is wilted. You may see that there are spots on the leaves. You may see bite marks from insects, and those things can happen pretty rapidly, right? So for example, if you have a pest like a tomato hornworms can decimate tomato plants in just a matter of days. So that's why it's really important that you're out there regularly checking your garden, asking yourself what's different, right? And it's a good idea to be out in your garden maybe even 2 or 3 times a day because things can change that rapidly. So make sure that you frequently go out in your garden and analyze your plants and see what looks different, and ask yourself, what looks different, and then get ready to do the research, right? So once you figure out what the issue is with your plants, head to Google, head to your local garden extension, figure out what the problem is and how you can appropriately fix that problem. But yeah, just keeping up with it and, checking in with your garden regularly is a good way to make sure that you can stave off some common problems. And then I would say lastly, just have fun with it. I think that's important is, everybody is going to have problems in the garden. I've been doing this for years now where I grow tomatoes every year, and I still have challenges that I have to deal with and face. There are things that I dealt with even this season. So for example, some of my tomato plants, I saw that they had some tutorial leaf spot on the bottom of their leaves. And so then I had to figure out how to fix that. I had to cut those lower leaves. I had to, get some copper fungicide and spray them on the plants. So these are things that are common. I've dealt with tomato hornworms. I've dealt with spider mites. And, no matter what phase of the garden growing process you're in, or what your expert or skill level is, you're going to encounter problems. And that's part of the challenge is, you're just going to have to, deal with those things. But that's also what makes it fun, right? Like you have these problems that you have to address and, figure out solutions to them. And at the end of the season, when you have tomatoes, it's an exciting, good thing, and you're proud of yourself. So I would say just kind of take all the problems in stride and be prepared for them and ready to attack them. So, and that's pretty much what I got for my presentation here.
Well, I've got some questions too. Oh, we've got saving seeds.
Seeds. I forgot about that. Yeah.
How do you hear about seeds? Like once you grow, because that's actually how Alex is growing his Thai pink egg that he showed. You saved the seeds on that one.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So that's a really big thing is, obviously saving seeds. So I like to, one of the ones that I like to go to is Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds. They've got all sorts of unusual heirloom tomatoes from years and years ago. And so one of the ones that I found on there was the Thai pink egg variety. It's a market variety from Thailand. It's one of my all-time favorite tomatoes. So I grew it that first year from seeds from Baker Creek, and then they no longer offered it. I was really lucky because I got a volunteer tomato, which is basically like, a tomato falls in your garden, and then next year you have a tomato that came from that tomato seeds, right? So I got a volunteer Thai pink egg, and I'm like, this is awesome because I have the seeds from Baker Creek. But I had this tomato plant now that was growing the Thai pink egg variety that I liked. And so every year after that, I've been saving seeds. And that's really important because, when you're on nursery websites or seed websites, a lot of those varieties don't stay year after year. They rotate out their offerings, right? So if you have one you really like, it's not a bad idea to save the seeds from it. And as you save the seeds year after year, it's going to adjust to your environmental conditions, your pest pressures. You're going to grow a tomato that's stronger and more suited to that area. So really how you extract the tomato seeds is through a process called wet extraction. So a common form of that is you scoop out the tomato seeds. What I like to do is I cut the tomato in half. I use a spoon and I dig out kind of like the pulpy part where the seed is. You throw that in a jar of water and you leave it for a period of days to ferment. And after that time period, the pulp will rise to the top and the viable seeds will sink to the bottom. And that's how you know that your seeds are ready. So you can put that through a strainer, you can wash the seeds off, and then what I like to do is I put them on wax paper and then I let them dry out fully. And that's really important. You want to make sure that the seeds are fully, completely dry and there's no moisture still around them, because otherwise that can cause mold to grow. But yeah, so once the seeds are fully dried out, then you can put them in some sort of storage. I usually put mine in a Ziploc bag and label it with duct tape, and then you have tomato seeds for next year. So
I want to add something about seed saving too, is instead of using a plastic Ziploc bag, I bought a big box of coin envelopes from Staples, and they're little paper envelopes that seal, and then you can write on the envelopes, and they're not airtight, and so if there is even a trace of moisture, it's not going to be an issue because the paper envelopes aren't airtight. So that's plus the fact that you can write on them is pretty useful. So
that's awesome. Yeah, I'm gonna try that. I haven't done that before. What I've been doing, I've been like, I have to get duct tape and write on it with like a Sharpie. Right?
Yeah, it's too much work.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's awesome. I'm gonna try that. I'm gonna get those coin packets.
Yeah.
Wait, so something that's come up from everybody, like I think we've gotten like 5 questions on this. Everybody wants to know about suckers and pruning. What is a sucker? So at first somebody needs to tell us what a sucker is, other than somebody like me trying to grow tomatoes with probably not enough light. And also like should you prune your tomatoes? Because as Alex knows, I think I cut off too many of my tomatoes. So if you can tell us, like you guys can talk a little bit about pruning, when you should prune, how you should prune, and what the heck suckers are, that would be awesome.
Yeah. So your suckers, basically what they are is, if you look at your tomato plant, you have 2 different kinds of like leaves or shoots on your tomato plant. So you have the main stem, and then you'll have leaves that are coming out like straight at like 180 degrees. Those are your photosynthesis leaves. And then between your main stem and those photosynthesis leaves, you'll have another kind of set of leaves or shoots that come out at a 45-degree angle that look like almost kind of like another tomato stem coming off of your main stem. That's a sucker, right? And so really some of the reasons that you might want to trim off a sucker are to make your tomato plant more manageable. And if you let your indeterminate tomato plant grow too many suckers, you'll have this big, huge, wild, unwieldy plant that's harder to maintain. It's there's less airflow coming through the plant, so it's more susceptible to diseases. And there are some people believe that as you have more suckers, the quality of the fruit that you have declines, because each sucker is capable of making fruit, right? So if you have a bunch of different suckers, that takes energy away from the main stem. There's some debate on that. I've also talked to experts who say that that's not true, that you can have a bunch of suckers and still have great tomatoes. But definitely for the first 2 reasons, keeping the plant manageable and having greater airflow through the plant, it's a good idea to remove the suckers. And you can kind of do it throughout the season as you see them develop. Just kind of, you can either pinch them off when they're really small, or you can take a pair of garden shears and cut them off that way. One thing that I do, and I don't know how Laura deals with suckers, but I kind of, when the season gets later and it's hotter and drier outside, I kind of leave some of the suckers on so that the plant has greater protection from the heat, and I kind of ease off a little bit so that there's more protection from heat and sun, and you don't have as many issues with sun scald. So that's kind of how I deal with suckers.
Yeah, that's a good summary. You can also sometimes you can start a new plant from trimmed suckers. So if you have a plant that's going downhill, or you want to kind of, you want another one of them, sometimes you can take that sucker and put it in water and it'll grow roots. So if you want yet another tomato. But yeah, sometimes, especially if you hit it with Miracle-Gro, that tomato plant will get very big and bushy. And like Alex says, you want to have some good air circulation through that plant. We are in a dry climate, but we still have, there are some species of mildew that will attack your plant in dry climates. And so allowing that air to flow through the plant helps prevent that issue. So my daughter just got home and the dog is excited. So So that's a good point. When they're just starting out too, another thing that we do is just when they're starting to get maybe about a foot tall, we clip off those bottom branches and leave the bottom part of the plant kind of naked looking, because it helps. To us, what we've noticed, it helps prevent disease. It seems to not, the bottom leaves are more susceptible to getting eaten or getting diseases, and so getting rid of those bottom leaves, it helps it, and then plus we can grow things underneath it too.
So even though those are like the photosynthesis leaves, we have a couple questions about that. It's okay to prune those photosynthesis leaves like close to the bottom. That's all right.
Right. You don't want to take too many off. I mean, you don't want to take all of the suckers off because, the plant does need that to make food for the tomatoes. So you don't want to take all of them off. But like Alex says, a lot, it can get kind of excess. And so you may want to thin the plant out a little bit.
And then Kathy's got a follow-up question on that. So the middle's got more air. She's asking, she loves it when her tomatoes get big, but pruning out the middle, so the middle has more air. So is that like where you should be looking for those suckers kind of, I guess, in the middle, not the top of the plant, but and not the bottom of the plant?
Yeah, right smack in the dense part of it. Well, what we do is Jim built this structure. It's like a frame, and then we hung remesh, concrete reinforcing mesh on the structure. And so the squares there are about 6 inches square. And then as the tomato grows, we kind of weave it in and out of the squares. And so when we have an indeterminate tomato, it gets really tall. I mean, it gets like 8 feet tall. And so as I'm pushing these back and forth through the remesh, I'm trimming off the odd occasional weirdos that are sticking out. So that's one way of doing it. Just, there's no real set way of doing it. You just kind of want to cut out the excess. I don't know if that makes sense.
About seeds. People want to know, is it too late in the season for a productive season right now? Is it too late to start from seeds if you were to start this weekend?
No, you're probably still good. You want to be careful there, because when you're growing them from seed, usually what you want to do is you want to put that little 6-inch plant out in the garden, so it can grow with real sunlight instead of like in a windowsill or under a grow light. And so if you start from seed now, when that plant gets to the size where you're going to put it outside, that's when we're getting we're starting to get the 95, 100-degree weather. So that's something that you have to be careful of. If you've got a spot that you can protect it from the heat, then hey, go for it. But I always recommend buying the starts from the store.
Yeah, and I would say that if you plant them at that stage, once you have a 6-inch plant or so from seed, and you're planting them in, say, July or August, there's a chance that you may not actually have fruit from that plant until maybe even September or October, because keep in mind that the plants kind of go through a period of stasis where they're not producing as much when it gets really hot. So don't expect that it's going to be setting fruit soon after you plant it. It could be a period of a few months even, just because it'll be so hot outside.
You're kind of tempting fate when you put a little baby plant out, because it seems like when we put a lot of seedlings out, one year we put a whole bunch of seedlings out in early June, and then we got hit with 105-degree weekend, and we pretty much had to start over from scratch. I think we tempted fate by planting everything at once. So
I've got lots of questions about pests, guys. So, I mean, I think we've all had these issues with the pests. One of them, somebody said that she tried the neem oil for aphids, then the leaves curled. She didn't think it had been that hot. How can she resolve the curls? She's trying to water more too. So I guess a couple questions there. One, what should you do for aphids? And two, what happens when the leaves are curling? I saw a couple other questions about that too, because that's when I got a little aggressive in giving my trees a haircut, because the leaves started wilting when it got a little hot, and I think I overdid it.
lot of times the leaf curl is due to like water stress. Although when you see curled leaves, open them up and see if there's somebody living in there, because occasionally you'll get like a little critter that's like, you know, a cocoon or something in there. But usually leaf curl is due to water stress. So make sure that you're watering it regularly. And all of us master gardeners swear by mulch. So like when you put your tomato plants out, put grass clippings or some fine mulch underneath the plants. That will help ameliorate the water stress, because you know you get really hot weather and then the top inches of the soil dry out, and that's where most of your tomato roots are. So it's going to stress that plant. Even if you've watered it, if it dries out, it's not going to like it very much. So the leaf curl is probably more due to water stress. For aphids, you remember my violent aphid imagery column where I talk about aphids. They have a mouthpiece, a proboscis, that actually stylet, I guess is what it's called. And they put it directly into the plant's tissue, and it taps right into the plant's vascular system. And it stays there. He doesn't pull it out and then re-poke the plant. I mean, when it goes into the plant, it's fixed. And so that aphid is stuck to that plant with his nose like buried into the plant's vascular system. So if you come along with a garden hose set on jet and you blast those aphids off, you've basically ripped their noses off, and they're going to be on the ground. They're not in any shape to climb back up, because people go, well, if you blast them off, aren't they going to climb back up? It's like, no, they're not. They're gonna just lay on the ground and die. But they do reproduce very quickly. So it's something you have to kind of keep on. You have to constantly keep spraying your plants. And like Alex says, it's important to keep an eye on things, because especially with aphids, because they're born pregnant. And so I thought I was bad, but I have a bunch of kids. So when you have something like aphids, you do have to go out like every day and blast especially the tender growing tips. Hit those guys, because that's what the aphids like the best. They usually, like tomato hornworms, seem to be the biggest problem for us.
That, you know, it's funny you say that, because a lot of people are asking about those. I mean, I think they're kind of cool looking until they eat all the tomatoes, but those are those green, green ones that look like they have a gazillion eyes, but that's actually like their body. Those are the tomato hornworms, right? Like, how the heck do you get rid of them? Is there a way to get rid of them organically? Can you spray something, or are you just doing battle with them every day?
You can hand pick them. You know what I do it with my kids when their friends are over. This is when they're like all 10, 8 to 10 years old. I sent them out in the garden because we kind of neglected to spray BT on our tomato plants, and we had quite a crop of hornworms. So I sent them all outside with their friends with these little like school scissors, and I said, okay, find those hornworms and cut them in half and show your friends how to do it. And so it was really fun, because they're all out there, and then I hear, there's one, I've got it. And then you hear a big chorus of, ew. We don't believe in buying our kids violent video games, but I send them out to cut the hornworms in half. And by the way, if you cut a hornworm in half when the temperature outside is over 100 degrees, they will squirt like 3 feet. So be mindful of where you're standing when you cut them in half. That's news you can use. I didn't even know we'd know that, say. So you're taking your kids and yourself, and then you get the hornworms taken care of too. So
we've got some questions about whiteflies too. Like, whiteflies are also, they're not our friends.
Yeah, whiteflies, they you know what, when you get like the tomatoes will drop their leaves. They drop, like when they do occasionally will like lose occasional leaves, and they drop on the ground. Take those guys and pull them out of there, because the leaf detritus we found is like a really good breeding ground for whiteflies. I don't like to use pesticides, even something like pyrethrin, which is considered organic, but it's broad spectrum. So when you spray a pesticide, you're killing your friends. So it will kill like ladybugs and lacewings and things that you really want to come into your garden, because they're your helpers. But to do like more of the cultural practices of like, garden hygiene is what they call it. Where you pull dead leaves away and make sure that the air circulation is good. That seems to keep the whiteflies at bay. So I would recommend that before any kind of spray.
So we've got a couple questions from folks who live closer to the ocean. Ryan wants to know if there are any special considerations, and somebody else whose name I have lost, they had a tomato plant, but they are dealing with mildew. So if you're like more coastal, what should you keep in mind?
Well, probably the copper sprays for that you would use for mildew probably would work. Those that we're going to need like repeated applications. So yeah, always read the directions, make sure you're using the right concentrate, and that you're make a reminder on your Google Calendar, so you end up, because something with mildew is going to be a constant issue. So yeah, use that copper sulfate spray. Always make sure also to check the label, make sure it's safe for vegetable plants, and that should be, but you never know.
Another question, some people have some more questions about shade cloth. Do you leave it up overnight and for weeks at a time, provided it's hot?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I will, what I do is I like to keep my tomatoes in tomato cages, and I will just drape the shade cloth over the tomato cages, and I'll put the material that I have, it has like circular rungs on the outside, and I'll put a bamboo stake through that, and I'll just keep it over top of my tomatoes, and I'll keep it, if I know that there's going to be like 90 or 100-degree weather for a period of a week or longer, I'll just keep it on. I'll keep it on there because there's no point taking it off at night. Because the next day it'll be 90, 95 again. It doesn't hurt the tomatoes or anything. They'll be just fine.
And now you said, because yours are in cages, so you put them over, because Diane asked about the best way to put that shade cloth over the large plants in the raised bed. So you kind of just hook it through the cages. Is that right, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I drape it directly over top of the cages. I mean, there are a variety of ways that you can do it, but I found that works for me. So I take the fabric, I put it on top of the round circular edge of the cages. And then I put stakes through like the outside edges, like there are holes like on the four corners of like the sheet. There are holes like metal rings, and then I put bamboo stakes through that, so that it's over top the cages, and then there's something in the ground to support it and keep it held in place.
And if you take it off, you'll guarantee you forget to put it back on when you get a day that's 110. So just leave it.
I have learned I've learned the hard way with that, where it's, it was 100 degrees in July, and I was like, oh, the next few days we're supposed to be like, in the high 80s. I'm like, I can take it off now. And then wouldn't you know it, there was a heat wave just a few days later, and I had forgotten to put it back on. So I would say, if you know that the weather is going to be hot for a period of time, just keep it on. Don't, because otherwise you'll forget.
And C. Dawson asks, is that a special fabric, or can you use anything for that shade cloth?
No, you want to buy shade cloth.
It's called shade cloth. So when you go to Home Depot, you can ask the store associates for shade cloth, or you can, if you're on Amazon, you can look up shade cloth. That specific material is called shade cloth. It's kind of like a dark, meshy kind of, not sure how to describe the material, but it is a specific material that's called shade cloth. Yeah, it's plastic, so it's not going to be damaged by water, and it's a little bit more sun resistant. So that's another thing. But they also, I think they sell shade cloth in like a white color too. And so if you're like in the desert, especially, and you get really wickedly hot, then that light colored fabric is going to protect your plants from the excessive heat. But I've seen it sold on, I've seen it sold off the rolls too. I think at Lowe's or something, they have like a big roll of it. And if you go to, serious garden centers, like, well, Armstrong's, but also any place where the farmers shop, they'll have it in large quantities too.
So we've got some questions about tough skins from Linda and Diane. Diane's also got a little bit more involved one here. Last year, she planted tomatoes in a large pot. The skin was very tough and hard to eat. She did give the plants tomato food, and some of the leaves turned yellow. What can she improve on this year so she doesn't have those tough skins?
Once again, it's probably due to water stress. I've seen also if you leave the tomatoes on the vine for a little bit too long, you know, once they're ripe, then they'll start to toughen up as well. But mostly due to water stress. And the yellow leaves, if you're growing in a pot, you probably want to replenish your soil. You know, use like a compost top dressing or something a gentle, I would say, a gentle type fertilizer to keep the nutrient. Because when you're picking fruit, when you're growing edibles and you're picking fruit, you're taking those nutrients out of there. You're removing the nutrients from the plant. So you owe that plant some nutrients. You need to put some stuff back. So that may be the issue there.
Paul Green has a great question. When should calcium / gypsum / eggshells be applied?
For the most part, I don't recommend gypsum. We used to use it when we just were starting out, but gypsum is an alkaline soil additive, and our natural soil here, at least in the Inland Empire, is really quite alkaline enough. Some people use gypsum to flocculate the soil particles, where the soil particles will stick together and make the soil crumbly, so it's not like a slab of concrete, which is what you usually get when you move into a house, right? So with gypsum, I don't really recommend it. I think that we've gotten better results from adding compost and more organic material into the soil, and that seems to make the soil healthier. So I don't recommend gypsum anymore. And eggshells are okay because they add some calcium. You can just add those anytime if you want. I mean, that's not a big deal.
And the calcium, it prevents blossom end rot, right? I know we got a couple questions on that, and isn't that,
yes.
If I remember correctly from editing your column these years, it's
yes.
like that's how you keep blossom end rot away.
Yeah, you can use the eggshells, and then also, like, you know, there's fertilizers that have more than just the NPK. They have other nutrients. So there's actually fertilizers specially formulated for vegetables. So you may want to look at those, or add like bone meal is another additive that will add calcium to the soil. But bone meal is really quite expensive.
So I've got a question here from David. He is trying to grow tomatoes in clay pots in the California desert. He needs help with watering. We have a lot of questions about watering. So if both of you can talk a little bit more in depth about the watering and how you can tell like when it's time. Like I like just stick my hand into the pot of tomatoes and I'm like, this feels dry. It doesn't feel damp anymore. It's time to water. Is that what I should be doing?
Yes, absolutely. That's the best way to tell. Sometimes with a natural soil, like we'll water, and then the top, this is when we don't have mulch, the top will dry out and form this horrible looking crust, crackly crust thing. But if you break through that, sometimes it's like still moist underneath. So with soil, you always want to make sure that you're, just take a little trowel and dig a few inches down and see if it's moist, and the moisture level should be like that of a squeezed out sponge. You don't want it to be muddy, because then you're going to invite root rot. So also the symptoms of overwatering and underwatering are remarkably similar. And so if you have a plant that's wilted, a lot of times people see their plants wilted, they don't bother to check the soil, they'll just give it more water, not realizing that maybe the drainage holes are blocked, and that plant is drowning and it's wilting because it's got a fungus. So yeah, always check your soil like an inch or so below the level to make sure it's not soggy.
And along those lines, we got to start wrapping up. Everybody's got so many good questions. By the way, we are capturing these questions. We will send out this recording later. If you joined us late or if you missed an answer, you're going to get a copy of this so you can go back to it. And we'll also be collecting these answers and getting you questions and getting you some more answers. But I think a great way to end is like, can you define what water stress is and how to figure that out on your tomato plant?
Just water stress would be like, I've had this happen before where you water it a lot and then you forget to water it, and so it dries out, and then you water it a whole bunch more, so it's getting uneven watering. That also will cause for poor quality fruit. It stresses your plant out. So water stress could be too much water, too little water, or too much followed by too little followed by too much. So I guess that's kind of the best way to describe it.
So be consistent, check your, like dig your hand in the plant, make sure it's getting the water. And should you water at nighttime or in the day? Does it matter? Early in the morning? And we'll end with that, Sam, before I want to answer the questions. The people have so many great questions.
Yeah, so you want to water in the morning, and morning rather than evening. And the reason being is because that lets the plant dry out throughout the day, right? If you water during the evening, there's more of a chance that it's going to have pathogen or fungal issues. Because you're watering and then the sun sets and it's cool and damp all evening long, and that really allows like the fungal issues to grow. So definitely water in the morning. A good way this is something that I learned from interviewing an expert, is a good way to tell that your plant is adequately watered is something called gutation. So you look at your tomato plant, and it's got so much water basically that it pushes droplets onto the outside of the leaves. And that's a good way for you to be able to tell that it's got adequate water. And again, like you may see like some stress midday for your plant. Like your plant might be kind of stressed out and wilty looking. Resist the urge to water in the middle of the day or in the evening. The reason being is because that's one of the ways that you can end up with fruit cracking, because the plant, you'll give it all this water, and it will in the hottest part of the day, it'll take all the water up. And then it won't know when to stop, and it pushes that water through its fruit, and that's how you get cracking tomatoes.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You guys, thank you so much. I am sorry we have to end the garden party today, but all good things must come to an end. Vanessa, Alex, Laura, thank you so much. This was tremendous, and thank all of you for attending today. This was just such an education. If you've got gardening questions, go to gardening@scng.com. And again, as Vanessa said, sign up for the Garden Party newsletter, where all the information you can ever want will be at your disposal. Listen, please join us for our next garden party on June 9th on troubleshooting common problems. And if you want more gardening insights from our experts, again, that newsletter is where to go. Meanwhile, I'd like to invite you to hang out next month when we restart our bookish series starting on June 18th. We've also got Marla Jo Fisher's Get Frumpy Happy Hour and many other fun things. So to register, go to scng.com/virtual events. As always, I encourage you to read our newspapers and visit our websites to stay informed. And equally important, entertained. If you'd like to share your thoughts from today or you have additional questions, please email us at events@scng.com. Thank you all again, and see you next time.